In the year 1219, at the height of the Fifth Crusade, St. Francis of Assisi and another friar, a companion, traveled to Damietta, Egypt. They traveled along with some crusaders with the intention of both preaching to the crusaders against the battles that were underway, as well as crossing the threshold, the border, to meet with Muslims on the other side of the battle line in a mission of peace and dialogue. St. Francis of Assisi was indeed perhaps centuries ahead of his time in understanding that the gospel call to Christian life meant letting nothing get in the way of relationship, even one's faith tradition. And he viewed not his Muslim sisters and brothers as enemies, but as siblings, as friends, as neighbors, as those he was called to love, and those he was called to engage with. Nearly 800 years after his death, the Second Vatican Council and the Church, in its decree Nostra Aetate on the Christian relations to non-Christian religions, writes that the Catholic Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in other religions, and makes a particular effort to talk about our relationship to our Muslim sisters and brothers. The Church regards with esteem, the document says, also our Muslim sisters and brothers. They adore the one God, living and subsisting in himself, merciful and all-powerful, the creator of heaven and earth, who has spoken to men and women, and they take pains to submit wholeheartedly to even his inscrutable decrees, just as Abraham, with whom the faith of Islam takes pleasure in linking itself, submitted to God. Since in the course of centuries not a few quarrels and hostilities have arisen between Christians and Muslims, this sacred synod, that is, the teaching of the Second Vatican Council at the highest level, urges all to forget the past and to work now sincerely for the mutual understanding and to preserve as well as to promote together for the benefit of all humankind social justice and moral welfare, as well as peace and freedom. Catholic Christians in a particular way are called, as we hear both in the Second Vatican Council's teaching, official teaching of the Church, its highest teaching, as well as in the example of people like St. Francis of Assisi, this move to understand, learn about, and to engage in interreligious dialogue. In order to do that, we must understand other religious traditions, and in recent years there's been increased hostility, perhaps second only to those terrible events of the various crusades back in the Middle Ages, between Christians of the global West and Muslims, especially in the Middle East. And we see a lot of Islamophobia, a lot of calls of violence and fear, a lot of discriminatory, racist, and ethnophobic, we can say, perspectives and statements on television and social media and elsewhere. I want to share with you a book that I just came to have a look at, a book that was just recently published this month, in November of 2015, and that's this. It's the HarperCollins Study Quran. What's very important and interesting about this text is that not only does it provide a new translation in English, and I must say, of course, as many of you already know, that in the Muslim tradition, in Islam, you cannot have an authentic translation in any vernacular language. That our sisters and brothers of the Islamic faith believe that the Holy Quran is the verbatim word of God that was transmitted to the Prophet Muhammad, and it was done so in Arabic. And so while there can be translations, such as this one that has just recently been published, to help in study, especially for those in other religious traditions or those whose primary language is not Arabic, it's important to make that distinction between a study text and what is prayed and what is studied in a more formal way within the tradition. But what's unique about this text is not only is it translated well in English, it's a new translation that took 9 years in working together among the editors and translators and scholars to produce, but there's also a tremendous amount of commentary. I can show you, perhaps you can see in here, I can show you up close, there's great resources, great explication and exegesis that helps people, especially those who are not trained in Islam, those who are not Muslim, like myself, a Roman Catholic priest, a Franciscan friar, to understand better what's at the core of the Islamic faith. There were excellent essays that introduce both the history and of not just Islam, but of the Quran, the history of its translation and study, the methodological background to this text itself and what we have here, as well as maps and other resources that are really of great use. I can't recommend this highly enough, and you may not find yourself buying this particular text, but I encourage you, especially if you have questions about Islam, questions about what our Muslim sisters and brothers believe, to first engage in dialogue with those in your community in a peaceful, understanding, open way, as St. Francis of Assisi himself did. But also I would encourage you to read the text itself. Sadly, those who tend to grab the news headlines because of tragic acts of violence and terrorism, people like those engaged with the ISIS group in Syria and Iraq and elsewhere, Al-Qaeda and other terrorists, they practice something that is not at all supported by the Holy Quran. It is not reflective of the Islamic faith, of the Muslim faith. And our Muslim sisters and brothers are really done a disservice when, as a collective community and as a popular sort of social imaginary, that way of interpretation, a very distorted and unhealthy interpretation of Islam, is portrayed as the normative face of this religious tradition. St. Francis of Assisi and so many others, and those who bother to study the text itself, to try to understand the richness and the peace, the justice, the depth, the metaphysics, the worldview, the understanding of God, their own respect for the faiths of Judaism and Christianity, what they call the religions of the book. All these things are, deeper and richer and fuller than the violence and the discrimination that exists in our world would lead us to believe. So I encourage you, I'll put the link below to where you can find more information about this particular translation and its commentary. And I encourage you to take a look, to read with openness and seriousness, rooted, of course, in your own faith tradition, but to explore what our sisters and brothers in the religious tradition of Islam believe, and to appreciate the richness and beauty of their sacred text as well. May the Lord give you peace.